Chapter 5 of Golden Ditches. 50 Stories Above the Sea. Just 94 years after the Stecknetz lifted its first batch of boats, Christopher Columbus made his famous landfall in the New World. He had scarcely dropped anchor on his return to Spain when news of his remarkable discoveries flashed like lightning all across Europe. Bold men of many nations soon sailed off into the uncharted Atlantic, urged on by the prospects of wealth and adventure. Some of them actually believed that Columbus had found the Spice Islands. Others felt sure that he had landed on some remote section of the Chinese mainland. On reaching the American coast, they sailed up every river and scoured each tiny inlet in search of the all-important westward passage. Surely, they reasoned, one of those waterways was bound to lead them to the fabulous wealth of the Indies. Among the daring voyagers was a Frenchman named Jacques Cartier. Sailing far to the north in 1536, he discovered the Gulf of St. Lawrence. For 6 full weeks, he sailed steadily southwestward through the Gulf and up the broad St. Lawrence River. Pushing doggedly against the powerful current, he finally reached the site of present city of Montreal. There he was stopped cold by a roaring, rock-strewn rapids. Believing that he had at last reached China, he named those churning waters La Chienne, which means China. Jacques Cartier never learned that the Orient lay nearly half a world away. No doubt Cartier was the first white man who wished for a canal to bypass those formidable shoals. Such a canal would have permitted him to sail on in search of oriental silks and spices. You can be sure his imagination was fired by the thrilling tales told by the many curious and friendly Indians. Pointing to the southwest, they told of a great inland sea and thundering waterfalls. A river flows there that has no end, they said. Although Cartier never got to see those mighty seas, other Frenchmen who came after him did. Traders, trappers, and priests poled and portaged their boats through the brooding forests beyond La Chienne until they finally reached the sparkling waters of Lake Ontario. From there, they fanned out in every direction. In the next 150 years, their canoes became a familiar sight along the shores of all 5 of the Great Lakes. Still, these daring explorers found no better route than the man-killing St. Lawrence, leading from these lakes to the Atlantic. This fact perhaps encouraged French settlers to start digging a canal around the Lachine Rapids around 1700. Bad luck plagued this project almost from the very start. Nearly 100 years passed before a passable waterway was opened. Crude as it was, this channel provided a welcome lift for tired travelers. Only a few miles upstream, however, shippers were forced to transfer their cargoes to smaller boats. These flat-bottomed scows were called bateaux. They were either pushed by long poles or dragged through the swirling cataracts by the hardy pioneers. Many a stirring tale of the rugged bateau boatman can be found in French-Canadian literature. It was nearly 300 years after Cartier's famous voyage before Canada had a waterway joining the Great Lakes and the ocean. Completed in 1832, the Rideau Canal at last linked Lake Ontario with the icy brine of the North Atlantic. This 126-mile ditch, with its complicated lock system, was constructed by the English army under orders of the Duke of Wellington. Like many canals built before and after the Rideau, it was rushed to completion out of military necessity. Canada and the United States were, at that time, constantly at each other's throats over boundary lines. Open warfare between the U.S. and England had broken out only a few years before the War of 1812. Supplies for the British forts on Lake Ontario had to move along the St. Lawrence under the constant threat of Yankee guns. A canal far back from the river seemed to be the only practical solution. An English colonel named By was ordered to build such a waterway. First, he moved his entire crew to a site in the dense forests along an ancient Indian portage route. There, he put them to work building a log cabin village. It was to serve as temporary quarters for workers during construction. At first, this lonely outpost was known as Bystown or Bytown in honor of the colonel. Oh, we got a lot of pictures here. When the digging was finished and the locks completed, Bytown simply refused to become a ghost town. As time wore on, its log shacks and narrow footpaths gave way to tall buildings and broad avenues. Then its name was changed to Ottawa, and it was chosen as the capital city of all Canada. Ottawa stands as a sort of Venice of the North, with its placid canal crisscrossing the city. A most ingenious system prevents freeze damage to the waterway's banks and seawalls and provides an excuse for two celebrations each year. During the fall festival, the water is simply drained from the canal. Then, when the long winter is over, a colorful ceremony accompanies the return of the waters. Although Bytown rose to fame, the Rideau Canal rapidly fell into disuse. Its 8 generous-sized locks that hoisted boats 81 feet in a quick series of stair steps became obsolete almost before they were nicely broken in. No gunboats ever locked through this $4 million bypass. A lasting peace, built on faith and trust, one that has become a model for nations everywhere, settled over the U.S. and Canada. Good neighbors had little need for a waterway such as the Rideau. This, coupled with the growth of larger ships unable to navigate its 8-foot-deep locks, hastened its decline. Today, only a handful of curious adventurers and vacationing tourists paddle along Colonel By's Ditch. Few remember that it was Canada's first important canal. In 1825, 7 years before Canadians celebrated the Rideau's opening, the most famous artificial waterway ever to exist on U.S. soil was completed. While cannon roared and bells tolled in a bang-up international celebration, the Erie Barge Canal opened to traffic. Called by many the 8th wonder of the world, it was an entirely man-made ditch, more than 363 miles long. It slashed a wide swath through the wilderness of upper New York State, joining the Hudson River at Albany with Lake Erie at Buffalo. Here, at last, was the first truly practical route connecting the eastern seaboard with the Great Lakes. A great wave of immigrants followed the big ditch to the rich farmland of the Ohio Valley. Soon the canal was jammed with boats loaded to the gunwales both upbound and downbound. Pioneer families loaded their plows, household goods, and even squawking chickens and squealing pigs aboard the barges and headed into the sunset. On their way, they met boats piled high with furs, timber, and grain bound for the big market at New York. From its very first day, the Erie Canal boomed with success, but it had one glaring fault. At the Atlantic end of the waterway, imported goods had to be transferred from ocean-going ships to barges. Then, when the canal boats reached Lake Erie, their cargoes had to be again shifted to lake steamers. Of course, no one claimed that the Erie was a perfect solution to the transportation problem, but it certainly proved to be the best one so far. Its faults merely pointed up the crying need for a canal capable of handling full-sized ships. Wishful dreamers as well as hard-headed engineers constantly studied the mighty St. Lawrence from every angle. Here was a great stream flowing from Lake Ontario all the way to the Atlantic. At first glance, this route seemed to offer no end of promise. But in its tumbling descent, the St. Lawrence posed problems. The St. Lawrence posed problems that dashed the wildest hopes of even the most daring diggers. Miles of rocky shoals and roaring rapids teamed up with long expanses of scarcely knee-deep water. Many a determined engineer turned his back in despair on the seemingly insurmountable barriers of the seething St. Lawrence. Still, the challenge remained, facing each new generation with the same old problems. Need for a big ship route from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes grew as rapidly as the population. But it was not until 1932, nearly 400 years after Cartier sought such a passage, that a treaty for construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway was signed by the U.S. and Canada. More than 25 years after that agreement, on April 25, 1959, the Seaway finally knifed its way through the last almost impossible obstacle. It took the combined brains and brawn of two great nations to rip out the 189-mile channel that has already changed the lives of millions. Problems of unbelievable proportions faced its builder on every hand. To overcome them, they devised machines so unusual and powerful that they seemed like legendary giants from some other planet. That sure sounds like they used determination to do it, doesn't it? Among them was a walking shovel, weighing as much as 450 ordinary automobiles. This 650-ton behemoth was affectionately called the Gentleman. His mammoth iron-toothed jaws could munch a 20-ton bite of rock and earth every 48 seconds. Walking shovel, huh? Just one of these enormous beetle-like monsters could move more rubble in one day than 1,000 slaves. Furthermore, they never grew tired and could operate around the clock in numbing cold or blazing heat. There were times when the temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero. At others, the snow piled in mountainous drifts, burying equipment and blotting out the channel. But still the dauntless diggers blasted away. Highways and railroads crossing the main channel created king-size headaches for both engineers and workmen. $7 million were spent on one bridge alone to lift its center span so it would soar above the tallest masts. Jacques Cartier would surely have cheered the ingenious method used to raise this huge bridge named in his honor. When ordered to lift the center span nearly 50 feet without stopping the flow of traffic, the builders worked out a bold and daring scheme. Powerful jack screws were placed at carefully selected spots beneath the bridge supports. Then, little by little, the screws were wrenched upward. Little by little, day by day, week after week. New foundations followed, and the screws until the desired level was reached. So slowly and gently was this tricky operation performed that many regular users of the bridge scarcely knew what was happening. What a thrilling experience it must be to wriggle through a traffic jam nearly 100 feet above the romantic St. Lawrence. Imagine how scary it would be to learn that the entire structure stood on a mere handful of slender steel screws. It seemed that one problem was no sooner whipped than a new and bigger one popped up. Double trouble faced the engineers who designed another section containing the St. Lambert Lock. Here, both a busy highway and a railroad had to cross over the main channel. The resulting solution looks like a masterpiece straight from the pages of Leonardo da Vinci's Notebook. On either end of the lock, a lift bridge carries both trains and automobiles. These two bridges are part of the rim of a gigantic traffic circle. When one is lifted to allow the passage of a ship, all traffic flows without interruption over the other. As the ship nears the other rim of the circle, all vehicles are shunted over the opposite bridge. Not a single moment of time is lost by either ship or surface traffic. I think we should look that up. I wonder what it's called. It just says that it is the part of a busy highway and railroad that goes over St. Lambert Lock. Let's look that up. On either end of the lock, a lift bridge carries both trains and automobiles. That's going to be really cool. Let's look that up. As the Seaway drives steadily inward toward the Great Lakes, it climbs a fantastic flight of stairs. When ocean-going ships finally steam into Duluth, Minnesota, they have climbed 602 feet above the level of the Atlantic. Amazing. By then, they have navigated a series of ultra-modern locks, 8 of them on the Welland Canal alone. You may already know that this canal joins Lake Ontario and Lake Erie and bypasses the Roaring Falls at Niagara. In its 27-mile stretch, the Welland boasts seagoing ships. In its 27-mile stretch, the Welland boosts seagoing ships 325 feet skyward. Built by the Canadian government at a staggering cost in time, money, and human lives, it now forms an important link in the St. Lawrence Seaway. I wonder how many people died. Although the Seaway's main purpose is transportation, a host of other benefits trailed in its wake. Some were already booming even before the first ship locked through. Giant lakes flooding more than 35,000 acres forced entire villages to move to higher ground. Mammoth house-moving machines straddled dwellings, lifting them gently from their foundations and trundled them off to new locations. Operators of these monsters boasted that they could move a house while the family slept without so much as awakening their cat. A common greeting between displaced villagers was that your house I met on the way home from town today?" In any case, houses as well as schools and churches were lifted from the path of the rising waters. Recreation areas sprang up along the new shorelines. Expensive waterfront property provided a rich source of new tax money. Manufacturers located plants close to the channel in order to take advantage of lower shipping costs. Towns mushroomed to handle the influx of workers. One outstanding factor that made all of this possible was a tremendous jolt of electric power. Over 1,600,000 kilowatts of new voltage surged through the transmission lines. All this new power is divided equally between the United States and Canada. For more than 100 years, the 1,000-mile unfortified boundary between the United States and Canada has served as a model of peaceful coexistence. Now, the fantastic accomplishment called the St. Lawrence Seaway adds another proud chapter to that record. This truly international stairway for ships opens the rich heartland of America to cargoes from all over the world. Surely the ghosts of Cartier, La Salle, and Colonel By must glow with pride as they watch tall ocean-going ships plying the Great Lakes. Here at last is truly the 8th sea. There were a lot of pictures in here. So that is the Mittelland Canal. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. This is the 1964 dedication of Moselle Canal and the Kaiser Wilhelm Canal. This is Charles Harvey builds the locks at Sault Ste. Marie. Let's see here. Now this top one is looking down from the sky, the gull's eye view of the sit-down portage at St. Mary's Leap. And then down here, the bottom picture says, tourists seldom have to wait for ships to lock through. The Sault averages 17,000 passages per season. And this picture on the facing page says the Killarnock Lock area is a favorite haunt for discerning fishermen. So on this side, this is the view looking down. And then this down here. And this is a place, the lock that the fishermen like. Or the waterway, what did it say? The Kilmarnock Lock is this one. And this is the one from above. And this is the Sault, S-A-U-L-T, where the boats pass through. This is kind of interesting. This says, the Moses Saunders Power Dam draws visitors from all over the world. A part of the St. Lawrence Seaway, the dam is the longest international dam in the world and was built at a cost of $650 million, shared by the United States and the province of Ontario, Canada. There are conducted tours of the dam and modern penthouses, which provide spectacular views of the river. YouTube so that our children and the Millers can share the book, because their library doesn't have a copy. This is a picture of the harbor of Montreal, Quebec, It's the biggest in Canada, and it's the third busiest in North America, even though it's almost almost 1,000 miles from the ocean. Installations stretch out over a distance of over 12 miles. This is a seagoing cargo ship, goes through St. Lambert's St. Lawrence Seaway near Montreal. Although 1,000 miles from the ocean, Montreal is one of Canada's largest seaports, thanks to the Seaway. And on the other side, it says Merricksville, Ontario was a well-established community long before the Rideau Waterway was opened in 1832. William Merrick, a millwright from Massachusetts, built his first log house here in 1796. A well-preserved blockhouse built at the same time as the locks as part of the overall military plan is a noteworthy attraction for visitors interested in historic landmarks. That's the first one. And that's where the Merrick Waterway was. And the upper lock at Kingston Mills is in the Cataraqui River Channel, north of Kingston, Ontario, is one of the first group of locks to pass through on a cruise of the Rideau Waterway from Kingston to Ottawa. All vessels should carry a copy of canal regulations and charts of the waterway available from the Queen's Printer in Ottawa, Ontario. And this is an upper lock from the settlement at Ottawa that began with the construction of the Rideau Canal. So this is the Kingston locks. Looks like they're here with like a wheel, almost like a steering wheel to work the lock. And then here's what now exists, what was part of the first waterway in Bystown that became Ottawa. This is just a picture of Venice, since it made a mention of Venice, which is famous. It has canals instead of streets all through it in Italy. And then there's this really weird, I have no idea why this picture isn't here. It's labeled in Kashmir, India. The supermarkets come and go at will. Why it's stuck in this chapter, I don't know. But it's a guy paddling boats that are filled with vegetables. I don't know. And that is chapter 4.